June 4, 1942. The Aleutian Islands, Alaska, a chain of volcanic rocks stretching west from the Alaskan mainland toward Japan, wrapped most mornings in a particular kind of fog that sits so low pilots can see the wave tops beneath their wings and nothing beyond their wingtips. Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga had been in the air less than an hour. His target was Dutch Harbor, a U.S. Navy installation on Unalaska Island. Fuel tanks, warehouses, radio masts on a bare coastal ledge at the edge of the North Pacific. He had launched from the carrier Ryuho into weather that most pilots would have described as a reason to wait. He went anyway, because that was the assignment, and 19-year-old petty officers first class in the Imperial Japanese Navy did not decline assignments on account of the weather. A single bullet found the oil system. The engine was not dead yet. Oil pressure drops gradually, which is its own kind of cruelty. It gives a pilot exactly enough time to understand what is happening. This is WW2 Forgotten Frontline. What follows is the story of one aircraft, one 19-year-old pilot, one classified test report, and the specific way a secret hidden in an Alaskan bog reshaped the geometry of the Pacific Air War. Subscribe now. To understand what was sitting in that Alaskan valley, you need to understand what the Zero actually was. In the summer of 1940, 19 months of unrestricted Pacific combat had built the Mitsubishi Zero into something beyond an aircraft. It was a psychological fact. American pilots who had fought against it in the Philippines, over Pearl Harbor above Guadalcanal, brought back the same observations every time. Don't try to outturn it. Don't try to climb away from it. The Navy's commanders absorbed these observations and converted them into doctrine that amounted, in plain terms, to avoid fighting the Zero on its own terms. The doctrine did not say what the correct terms were, because no one had established that different terms existed. The Zero's empty weight was 4,100 pounds. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the primary American fighter of the period, weighed 5,700 pounds empty. The Zero's engine produced roughly 950 horsepower. The Wildcats produced 1,200. The mathematics of how tight an aircraft can turn are brutally simple. Lighter aircraft turn tighter. At low speed, in the kind of swirling turning fight that developed naturally when opposing fighters entered the same airspace, the Zero would get behind a Wildcat in seconds. And once it was behind, the fight was functionally over. The Wildcat had no armor on its flanks. Its fuel tanks did not seal when punctured. The Zero's 20 Mium and wing cannons delivered a result into an unarmored fuel cell that no pilot who survived it described in clinical terms. The Zero also had range so far beyond American estimates that Navy analysts repeatedly concluded Japanese carriers must be operating in positions their charts showed as empty ocean. The Zero at Guadalcanal had flown from Rabaul, 500 miles north. Its counterpart over the Philippines had lifted off from Formosa, crossing another 500 miles of open water. American fighters of the same period had roughly a third of that reach. The math seemed impossible, so the analysts decided it was impossible and searched for carriers that didn't exist. The Zero had not demonstrated a meaningful weakness in 19 months. No one had proven one existed. The conclusion was that it didn't. That evidence was sitting inverted in an Alaskan bog, slowly filming over with Aleutian moisture, waiting. Koga's standing orders were the ones every frontline Japanese fighter pilot carried, not written down, but understood the way critical knowledge moves through aviation training. Through repetition, until the fact lives in the body rather than the mind. If your aircraft is damaged beyond recovery, do not land it where the enemy can reach it. You roll it into the sea. You drive it into a hillside at full throttle. The machine cannot be taken intact. The oil pressure continued to fall. Below him, through the overcast, Akutan Island emerged 25 miles east of Dutch Harbor, uninhabited, volcanic. Its interior was a wide, flat valley of tundra that from 800 feet in dim Aleutian light looked exactly like a landing strip placed there by design. Koga lowered his gear and began his approach. The engine had minutes left. The valley floor was flat and open and wide. From altitude, he could not have seen what the tundra actually was. Centuries of Aleutian rain had built that valley floor into waterlogged bog-saturated grass and rotted plant matter soft enough to swallow a boot to the ankle. From 800 feet in sea mist, it read as firm ground. The wheels touched. They dug in on contact, and the Zero's nose drove into the earth. The aircraft pivoted over its own landing gear in less than a second, and slammed inverted into the ground at landing speed. The propeller blades bent flat against the cowling. The canopy cracked but did not separate. Both the restraints and the airframe held. The sudden stop killed Koga before the smell of fuel reached him. A broken neck. Instantaneous. He was 19 years old. The aircraft's skin was unmarked beyond the landing damage. Its instruments behind the cracked panel were largely intact. Its engine, when men who would spend months studying its every dimension came to examine it, would prove rebuildable. Koga had followed every order the tundra allowed him to follow. The one failure, the intact landing, the unburned airframe, the machine delivered whole to the enemy, was not a failure of will or training. It was the ground giving way at the exact wrong moment, the way the ground sometimes does, with no regard for what depends on it holding firm. Fuel spread in a slow dark ring through the wet grass around the wreck. Cold air moved through the valley. The cockpit was now inverted around him, the gray Aleutian sky visible through cracked canopy glass above his feet. For 54 days, nobody came. Subscribe to WW2 Forgotten Frontline right now, and leave a like on this video, because what happens when someone finally finds this aircraft is the moment the Pacific Air War begins to change. And we're almost there. On July 10, 1942, a U.S. Navy patrol aircraft sweeping the Aleutian chain banked low over Akutan Island and found the Zero. The crew could see from altitude that the aircraft was largely intact. They could see the red circle markings on the wings. When they dropped low enough, they could see the figure still strapped in the inverted cockpit. A recovery team from the destroyer US Williamson waded into the valley on foot. The tundra pulled at their boots with each step. The Zero's fuselage was cold to the touch, filmed with 54 days of Aleutian moisture along the panel seams. The canopy glass was cracked in a long diagonal line, but had not shattered. The propeller blades were bent with the particular violence of a sudden stop, rather than the progressive damage of combat. The aircraft had not burned. Koga was removed from the cockpit and buried on the island. The paperwork recording the location of that burial was not preserved in any record that subsequent researchers have located. He was 19 years old and has no grave that anyone can visit. The Zero was crated in sections and shipped by sea to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. Navy engineers rebuilt it to flying condition over the following weeks, working from the aircraft itself since no technical manual existed in any language they could read. They replaced the bent propeller. They repaired the canopy. They went through the airframe with the patience of men who understood that every fastener, every rivet pattern, every design decision they uncovered was information the Pacific Fleet was waiting for. By late August, it was flyable. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders walked onto the North Island tarmac on a California morning in September 1942 and looked at the most secret aircraft in the Pacific War, sitting in American sunlight, with American markings painted over the red circle. His assignment, framed by the Navy, was standard test pilot work: top speed, climb rate, roll rate, turn radius, structural limits. But the question underneath the assignment, the question every fighter pilot still alive in the Pacific was depending on him to answer, was more precise than that. His job was to find exactly where it stopped winning. He climbed in. The cockpit was smaller than an American fighter. The controls were light to the touch in a way that would have suggested looseness or imprecision in an American machine. In the Zero, the lightness was intentional. The aircraft's low-speed handling depended on controls responsive enough to allow rapid, precise movements at the speeds where it did its killing. The first flights were orientation. Sanders flew the Zero through its preferred speed range: low speed, moderate altitude, the envelope where Japanese pilots had spent 2 years building the aircraft's reputation. Everything the combat reports had described was confirmed. The roll rate was extraordinary. The turning radius was tight in a way that still surprised him despite knowing the weight figures. The climb angle was steep and sustained. He flew it the way the pilots who had built that reputation flew it. And he understood, with the physical certainty available only to a man inside the aircraft, why every American pilot who had engaged it at low speed had concluded there was nothing to be done. Then he pushed the throttle forward and dove. At 180 miles per hour, the controls were still light. At 200 miles per hour, the ailerons, the wing panels that tip an aircraft sideways, began to stiffen. Not dramatically, not a sudden seizing, but a measurable increase in the force required to move the stick sideways. Sanders noted it and kept accelerating. At 220 miles per hour, tipping the aircraft sideways required both hands on the stick. At speeds approaching 240 miles per hour, Those ailerons had stiffened to the point where Sanders could not roll the aircraft at all with the full strength of his arm. The Zero, which at 100 miles per hour could flick into a bank with a single fingertip, was at 240 miles per hour nearly incapable of rolling. He climbed back to altitude and ran the test again. The result was identical. He ran it a third time with instruments recording. The Zero was not invincible. It was invincible inside a specific speed range. Outside that range above approximately 200 miles per hour, it was an aircraft that could not track a maneuvering target sideways. A pilot diving away from a Zero at high speed, pulling away along a straight line faster than 200 miles per hour, was in the one position the Zero's design had no answer for. The aircraft could point its nose down and dive after a fleeing opponent. It could not tip sideways fast enough to keep its guns tracking a target pulling left or right at high speed. Sanders wrote his findings in a classified report and submitted it through channels. The report documented the specific speed threshold. It documented the absence of armor behind the pilot's seat. It documented the fuel tanks that would not seal when punctured, weight savings that had bought the Zero its extraordinary range, and its extraordinary low-speed performance at the specific cost of survivability in any engagement where rounds entered the airframe. It described, in the precise neutral language of a test report, everything the Zero could not do. The tactical summary that accompanied the report was not neutral. Do not turn with the Zero. Do not slow down near it. Attack from altitude at high speed and pull away before it can respond. The dive is not retreat. The dive is the weapon. Pacific Fleet fighter units began receiving copies in late 1942. The memo arrived through the same channels as fuel allocation reports and maintenance schedules, typed pages in a manila folder, distributed to squadron commanders, who passed them to their pilots during briefings in canvas tents and corrugated metal ready rooms across the theater. No ceremony. No announcement that the war had changed. The pilots read it. The ones who had been fighting Zeros for a year read it a second time, more slowly. Every pilot who had ever nosed his Wildcat over and run from a Zero at full throttle had been flying, without knowing it, the one maneuver the Zero's designers had not accounted for. They had called it panic. They had called it breaking off. The culture of aerial combat in 1942 did not credit men for surviving through tactics that resembled running away. A pilot who dove from a Zero was a pilot who had not stood and fought. What Sanders' report established was that standing and fighting a Zero at low speed was not courage. It was a misunderstanding of the machine. The Grumman Wildcat weighed 1,500 pounds more than the Zero. That weight, which had felt like a liability in every turning fight since Pearl Harbor, had a second consequence that no one had fully understood. A heavier aircraft in a dive accelerates faster. The Wildcat could reach and sustain the speeds at which the Zero's ailerons locked before the Zero. Following it down could close the distance. The pursuers and the pursued had been running this geometry for a year, without either side possessing the complete picture. Sanders' report explained what was actually happening in the space between two observations. The Americans knew they were surviving, and the Japanese knew their opponents were running. The change in the skies above Guadalcanal in late 1942 was not a single dramatic reversal. It was a shift in probability, accumulating across enough engagements to eventually look like a different war. Saburo Sakai, Japan's greatest living fighter ace, noticed it from the other side. American pilots, who had previously attempted to turn and fight, were instead climbing to altitude, rolling into steep dives, and pulling away at speeds that left his ailerons heavy and slow. Sakai understood the Zero's high-speed control problem from the inside. He had trained in the aircraft and knew its limits. For 2 years, he and every Japanese pilot of his generation had relied on one fact. No American pilot knew those limits from the outside. When American pilots began consistently attacking above 200 miles per hour, Japanese pilots saw the change without being able to fully account for it. Someone had told the Americans something. The source of that information was not apparent from the cockpit of an aircraft under attack. The source was a flat Alaskan valley and a 19-year-old boy who could not roll his aircraft into the sea before the oil ran out. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which began reaching Pacific Fleet squadrons in significant numbers in mid-1943, was in several measurable ways a direct engineering response to the Zero's documented characteristics. Its roll control stayed effective at high speed. Armor plate behind the pilot's seat, 212 pounds of it, stopped the rounds that had been killing American pilots through unarmored cockpit walls. That armor, was one of the specific absences Sanders had identified in his report. The engine produced 2,000 horsepower against the Zero's 950. The Hellcat was not a refined Wildcat. It was a machine built against a specific set of data that had not existed before September 1942. Sanders had measured the dimensions of the problem. Grumman's engineers built the answer around those measurements. The Zero did not disappear from the Pacific sky. It flew until the last day of the war and killed men until the end. But the myth of its invincibility, the invisible armor that had surrounded it through 2 years of unrestricted combat, did not survive the classified report that a test pilot filed from a California flight line after a series of dives in a dead man's airplane. The Akutan Zero, designated Bureau number 2185, and the most consequential single intelligence capture of the Pacific Air War, was destroyed in a landing accident at a California airfield in 1945. No senior officer had yet made a determination that the aircraft warranted preservation. It had served its purpose. The war it had helped reshape was ending. In the Navy's accounting of thousands of aircraft and millions of men, even this Zero was surplus hardware. It was written off accordingly. There is no Akutan Zero in any museum. There are surviving Zeros in various states of reconstruction, composite aircraft built from multiple wrecks and parts, displayed beneath careful museum lighting. None of them is the aircraft that Koga landed on Akutan Island. Eddie Sanders survived the war. He gave interviews late in life that confirmed his findings with the same precision he had applied to the flights themselves. He considered the Akutan tests, by his own account, a straightforward professional assignment that had gone as planned. No medals for the California flights. No headlines. His declassified test report remained in the Navy's files, read by historians and researchers decades after the pilots who had acted on it were old men or headstones. Tadayoshi Koga has no grave that can be located. He was 19 years old. He had followed every order the tundra allowed him to follow. The record of what was done with his remains ends with the sailors who waded through the bog to reach him. What remains of all of this is the changed shape of the war, the altered geometry of 10,000 subsequent engagements, the pilots who came home because someone read a classified report in a canvas tent and adjusted their dive angle by a few degrees, the Hellcat that was built around measurements taken from a dead man's aircraft on a California runway. None of it can be credited to one crashed airplane alone. But without the Akutan Zero, the arithmetic runs differently. How differently is a question the Pacific's floor cannot answer, and neither can any archive. Koga carried his orders into that cockpit on June 4, 1942. The Tundra carried out different ones. The secret he was ordered to keep became, in the hands of one methodical test pilot and one classified memo, the specific instrument of its own defeat. Subscribe to WW2 Forgotten Frontline. Leave a like if this story landed and tell me in the comments, does a 19-year-old pilot who followed every order he was given until the ground betrayed him deserve to be remembered by name? He does. And now you know it.